Welcome, everyone, to another episode of DiEM25 TV, our not so overly produced program. My name is Davide Castro, and I will be your host this evening. And what better way to tackle some of the biggest issues of our time than to have with us here tonight American stand-up comedian Judah Friedlander. Now, if you're not already familiar with Judah's work, and no, I don't mean the betrayal of Jesus, I suggest you definitely look it up. In his last independently produced film, stand-up comedy film, which is also available on Netflix, which is called America is the Greatest Country in the United States, Judah satirizes some of the biggest issues of our time, including American exceptionalism, fascism, climate change, you name it, amongst many other light topics, which is precisely, let's say, what our movement DiEM25 was created to address in a gentle but rather firm fashion. Now, remember, if you're watching this on YouTube, well, that's the only place you could watch it. Remember that you can leave your questions in the live chat below, and we will do our best to go through some of those questions towards the end of the program. Now, let's get started. Hopefully, Judah, you can hear me properly and well. First, before we get into the nitty-gritty of the discussion, I just wanted to ask you, Judah, how are you doing? How's everything going? And how has COVID-19 impacted your work so far?
First of all, great introduction, and apologies for all the weird body and facial movements before this started here. Thankfully I'm doing all right. I was sick for a little bit, I don't know, about a month ago, but thankfully I'm doing all right. Yeah, as far as work goes, well, I do stand-up comedy, so right now it's you can't do it because you need stand-up comedy, in my opinion, is not a monologue. It's a mixture of a monologue and a dialogue. So you can't have people around. So I haven't done it yet, but next week I'm gonna experiment around doing some live, I can see better now, some live shows online. So, yeah.
Yeah, I remember because you were saying when last time we spoke, you were mentioning that you have a couple of upcoming things that you're working on. And maybe you can also tell our audience a little bit more about your independent film that you released in 2017, America's Greatest Country.
Okay, yeah, if people haven't seen it, and I'm sure most people haven't, it's America is the greatest country in the United States, and you can't argue with that. So basically it's tons of jokes, one-liners, crowd work, heavy persona, and it satirizes, what's going on in the world, what's going on in the USA. And, it satirizes American exceptionalism, because in America, from the time people are little kids, they're given lots of propaganda that not only is the US the greatest country in the world, it's the greatest country in the history of the world. And most Americans, I don't think, know that they're being given this propaganda. And it comes from the Democrats, the Republicans, the media, your schools, you're taught that. So I think being confident as a person or a society is good. Being cocky is not good. And so in my stand-up, I in a non-preachy way, I deal with and do jokes about all the big human rights issues that exist in the world. And I satirize Americans' response to it, as well as the government's response to it, and how it, oppresses people without many people even realizing it does, and world issues as well, so yeah, so that's I'm not good at talking about my
your own work.
Yeah.
Well, there was one thing that struck me, and I remember watching something that you said recently, which was about the Democrats and the Republicans. And what you said, correct me if I'm mistaken, was, well, on the one hand, you have this argument that, if you're a Republican, the other must be the enemy, and if you're a Democrat, it's the same thing, and vice versa. And your comment was, well, why can't they both be bad?
Yeah, well, yeah, because it's, a lot of people, and that confuses a lot of people. And, the propaganda that America has, that we're the greatest, that that sets people up for disappointment and confusion and analyzing things wrong. Because if you're taught that your country's the greatest, well, then something besides your country must be fucking it up if it's not going well for you, you know? Or, you know, so the Republicans, they'll blame everything on the Democrats. They'll blame it on immigrants. They'll blame it on everyone but who we are. You know, America's very good at looking out the window and blaming things on people over there. They're very bad at looking in the mirror and seeing what you're really doing. So those are the, you know, the kind of the things I talk about. But what was your question? I'm forgetting it. Oh yeah, that's what I was saying. Yeah, so a lot of people, you know, and in the media, you know, you get, you know, there's basically two sides of the media, you know, and there's the mainstream corporate Democrat side, and then there's the Republican side. And one of the myths of still many people, I mean, many people realize this is not a myth, obviously, but a lot of people don't, you know, is that there's a left wing and a right wing part of the United States, and there's not. There's, you know, you guys have discussed this on your show before, but you know, we have two right wing parties. There's sort of a regular right wing party, and then a far right party, but it's not presented that way, and most people don't see it that way. So most people, they want to put the blame on somebody, and then when they realize, you know, it's both, you know, they don't know what to do. So, you know.
Indeed, I mean, we could spend hours talking about.
Yeah, and the Democrats and the Republicans, you know, they're against each other, but they're really partners, because they do everything in their power to never let a third party get any power, and they're you know, they're two wings of the same corporate gang, you know. So
perhaps we'll get back to this later, but I wanted to go into a slightly different direction, which is basically to talk a little bit about comedy and humor. And like, you know, a lot of the time comedy is seen as something that lightens up the mood and alleviates our fears and anxieties, especially under the current circumstances with COVID-19. More and more reasons to be able to laugh and to be able to exert our personality and experience through those kinds of activities. You know, humor is one of them. But perhaps, do you think that comedy can go a step further, not just about, you know, alleviating our fears and so on, but also trying to help us to imagine a better future? Because Hollywood, as you very well know, is very good at imagining this dystopian realities that we might be experiencing in the future. You have all these kinds of films coming out, basically showcasing the kind of dystopian futures we might be experiencing, where the poor are getting poorer, the rich are getting richer, living in bunkers or somewhere in outer space.
Well, see, that's the problem with Hollywood. They're making movies about a dystopian future. We have a dystopian present. We have a dystopian past. You know, it's not just the future, you know. But with Hollywood, it's, you know, it's another thing where, you know, Hollywood has this idea, you know, the right wing in the US, they try to paint Hollywood as these crazy left wing progressive people, and Hollywood likes to view themselves that way, but they're really not. I mean, Hollywood, in my opinion, is a right wing corporate entity. And while you say they've done a lot of these dystopian movies, I think that's more because, you know, they've made them in the past and one of them made money, so then they just keep making them again. You know, a lot of people talk about Hollywood, how Hollywood they've run out of good ideas. They're not looking for good ideas. They're not looking for new ideas. Their business model is copy something that was done before that made money. You know, so basically their general business model is unoriginality. That's basically, you know, what they want. And they don't, and Hollywood really isn't as progressive as it likes to think itself. You know, it's you know, so anyways, that's another subject. What was your, I'm digressing again. What was
no, that's fine. Don't worry. We can digress all we like. The question really is, how can we use comedy in not just to, let's say, to imagine the end of capitalism, right? Because a lot of what Hollywood does, it imagines a worse situation in the future, a worse kind of life, a worse kind of planet, you know,
well,
where,
yeah,
so how can we use comedy in a different direction?
You know, as far as showbiz goes, I mean, the past several years and more than that, I keep getting further and further away from Hollywood and really being on the fringes of show business, as the way my act is, because in and what's frustrating about so much comedy on TV is that it's really not, for the most part, rebellious. It's really not, for the most part, insightful. It's usually, mainstream Democrat talking points, or you have some Republican talking points. It's usually, oh, the president, he's bad, he's orange, and he's dumb. You know, and that's if that's the extent of your comedy, you're not really hitting any big points. I mean, as bad as the president is, and he is terrible, but he would never have been elected if we would have had a good political structure to begin with. If we actually had a government that gave a shit about its citizens at all, someone who like Trump wouldn't have a chance probably of being elected. Maybe I'm being too optimistic there, but I don't know. But
that brings me to something that some people have been saying, which is that Donald Trump. Some people have been saying this, that Donald Trump is one of the most heavily satirized figures in politics, right? Yet his popularity seems to be surging and surging. Perhaps that says a lot about the kind of, I wouldn't even call it satire, and perhaps you can comment on that, but the kind of comedy that is done, which is more about making fun of somebody in power instead of actually critically going further and commenting on those issues.
Yeah, I mean, as bad as Donald Trump is, he did not create Jim Crow. He didn't create the Atlantic slave trade. He didn't, we don't have universal health care in this country. It wasn't, and a lot of, Democrats like to make fun of the Republicans, for voting against their best interests, but the Democrats vote against their best interests. Polls show most Americans want universal health care, yet the Democrats don't want it and the Republicans don't want it. So they're always working against us. I mean, even in, what's going on now, the giant corporations are being bailed out, and middle class and poor people aren't getting anything. So when I'm president someday, I'm going to create a vaccine for capitalism. That's what I'm going to do, and it's going to cost $25,000 per person. It's a perfect plan for the
Well, I wanted to touch on something else, which is slightly moving away from what you said.
But back to comedy, what we were saying, comedy, it can really be a survival mechanism. I mean, if you can't, now, we went in New York, we went into lockdown, I don't know, it was somewhere around, it was in the middle of March. It was around March 16th, I think. And I remember, I do a lot of stand-up shows throughout the world. I do a lot in Europe. I try to get to Europe a couple times a year doing shows. And I remember in late February, I messaged a friend of mine, Luca, in Italy, a comic from Rome, because at that point, Italy had been split in half, where half the country went into lockdown. And one of the reasons I think Europe hasn't done that well and with responding to the coronavirus, and the US has done one of the worst of many countries, if not the worst, at least so far, is because, I think there's a couple things. I think there's the, again, American exceptionalism. It's like, because initially the disease was in China, and they're like, oh, well, that's China. That ain't going to happen here. So I think there was this Western arrogance, as well as racism, where people are like, oh, that's the crazy Chinese people. Crazy stuff's always going there. That's not going to happen here. And in the US, when Italy went into lockdown, first of all, most people didn't even know about it. But even for those that did, I think are like, wow, those Italians, they're crazy. Look what's going on there. But they're not putting things together. They're looking at things through an uninformed and often bigoted lens that they're not even aware of. So I remember, so in February, and then also there is, the Chinese government can be very bad in many ways and very secretive in many ways, and they're not the only government to be that way. But so there's, there can be distrust there, which is, some of that is granted. But I'm not saying the Chinese people, I'm saying the Chinese government. But so in late February, I messaged my friend and I asked him, I said, so what's going on? Are you okay, first of all? And what's going on? And what do you think about it? And immediately he said, yes, we have to lock down. And he gave all the reasons. And I was like, interesting. That wasn't going to be my first guess. But the media and the news that we get here, you would never guess that. It was just looked at as, wow, this is crazy what's going on in Italy. It wasn't like it was, no, they should have acted earlier. And what they're doing now is appropriate to save lives. And then I messaged a filmmaker friend of mine from Korea, from South Korea. And she said the same thing. And she was like, yes, you must lock down. You have to stop it. And I'm like, okay, they obviously are further ahead on the timeline than we are and have more education and knowledge on what's going on. Because in New York at the time, in late February, nobody was, for the most part, was even thinking about this stuff. So anyways, I just find it interesting. You know, I often try to get my news, not just from many different independent sources, but from people and from people at different places throughout the world from all different backgrounds. So anyways.
Absolutely, you're completely right. And there's also the issue of the underfunding of public services for a very long time. You know, we have a system which consecutively and continuously essentially defunds public services, so that at some point in the future, those services become so bad that people will complain about them, and therefore they will use that as a justification to continue with the privatization schedules and plans, etc. And of course, you know, you see that everywhere across Europe, that you don't have enough hospitals well prepared enough in order to be able to deal with this COVID crisis in a much better way than they're dealing with it at the moment. So that's also something.
Yeah, I mean, the same thing's going on here, where, you know, doctors here, I mean, the first couple of weeks in New York, when the disease really hit in the first couple of weeks of March, you know, hospital staff is wearing garbage bags because they don't have the correct protective gear. And then also East Asia was way ahead of Europe and North America as far as face masks. You know, our government here actually was telling us in the beginning of March, don't wear face masks. They cannot help you. They might even make it worse for you. And then the next sentence they go like, and plus the medical workers need them. So they're like, okay, well, this is an easy lie to figure out, you know, that obviously you're fucking lying or being dishonest in some way or arrogant in some way, that, you know, masks, oh, we don't do that. Those aren't cool, you know, but it's like, if everyone's wearing a mask, of course that's going to help some. So.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, I wanted to ask you also about what's going on in New York now. I mean, what have been some of the measures? How's living there right now?
Well, I'm actually out of the city right now. My birthday was in March, and my parents are in Maryland, about an hour from Baltimore, about 45 minutes from Washington, D.C. And I always, you know, I visit it's about a 4-hour drive from New York. I always like to, or train ride. I always like to, you know, I visit them about once a month anyways. And when, you know, I thought New York was likely to get locked down any day. And this was right around my birthday. And I thought they might, you know, shut all the tunnels, the bridges, stop all the trains and buses and cars. And I was like, I might never see my parents again. And I want to see my parents. So I decided to, so on March 15th, I left the city. And so I haven't been there since. I'm talking to friends of mine all the time and stuff. And, you know, it's a mix. It's, you know, I think a lot of people have it in New York. And I don't know if I had it or not. I think it's very likely I did. One of these days when they get, you know, better and more available antibody tests, I'll do that. And I know tons of people who have had it, you know, just, I mean, a lot. So I just, but it's getting a little better in New York. But what I've noticed being out here and from talking to some other friends in different parts of the country, so much of our media talks about New York because that's been the worst hit, and it's the biggest city in the country, and so much of the media is based there. So they probably have some kind of bias in covering New York centric things. But as New York, you know, the cases are starting to dip a little bit and go down a little bit. In much of the country, it's still rising. And I think on the news, you don't hear about that stuff as much. You're mostly hearing about New York. So I think a lot of people are, when I first came out here, it was kind of a ghost town, not many people out. Now, a lot of people out, a lot of cars out. You go by the stores, a lot of people at the stores. So it's, and, you know, and the cases keep rising. So that's not good. And also people are getting antsy because, you know, our government here, I don't know in Brussels and Belgium what it's like, what they're doing for citizens there, but they're doing very, very little for citizens here, you know. But
Well,
it's no surprise. I mean, when we live in a society where the people who run the country are rich, they're going to make laws that benefit the rich. You know, we have rich people deciding how poor people should be cared for, and that's not going to fucking work.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's an example here that happened I think it was a week ago or two in Brussels, where there was a detention center, an asylum center, I think, for refugees that arrived in Brussels. And basically the government closed down, or I don't know if it was the Belgian federal government or the Brussels government, but in any case, they shut down the asylum center. They didn't provide adequate any accommodation for the 300 people that needed it. And therefore the 300 people were in a position that they had to find somewhere to sleep at night, and they were in a park in Brussels. And the day after, there were police with sniffer dogs that came to disperse the crowd, the people. I mean, it's crazy. On the one hand, they're not offering proper housing and spaces for people who need it, otherwise they might die. And on the other hand, you have the same state, the police forces, coming in and telling people that they cannot gather around, you know, because it's against the quarantine rules. So that's you know, stupid.
No, it's really scary. And, you know, I mean, in this country, you know, everyone's vulnerable, but the less money you got, the less white you are, it's the more you have to fight against, and the harder it is, you know. And that's the horrible reality that's there. So, you know, there are, you know, people and groups and organizations, you know, doing stuff, but as you know, the government's not nearly doing enough. And, you know, I mean, I've read things about how our government has been stealing protective equipment from other countries, including some European countries and Canada. And they're also doing it amongst our own states. You know, certain states will order equipment from overseas, and then the federal government will seize it, and then that state can't get it back. So it's, you know, the country, I think the US, you know, we've been at war with we've had a civil war for quite a long time now, and it's, you know, it's still going on. I think many people don't realize it, but it is, you know. Guns, you can still buy guns in the US. Guns are essential business. You can buy tons of guns. And apparently gun sales are higher than they've been in quite a long time. So, you know, it's crazy, but, you know, we'll figure out a way through it. I don't know what the ways are yet, but we'll figure it out.
I hope so. We have to.
Yeah.
I wanted to just change a little bit because I'm a bit conscious of time. It's already 20, almost.
Sorry.
Past. No, not to be sorry at all. I just wanted to change a little bit of topic and go back to what we were saying earlier about comedy and so on, and how to use comedy, perhaps in a more subversive way. Basically, I've been hearing a lot of people recently questioning whether we should have any reason to laugh at all, considering everything that's going on around the world. But my question to you is, well, isn't laughter the only remedy, the only antidote medicine that we have in order to deal with those issues which are so big in nature and so problematic? A kind of necessity, if you like. You know, what you think?
Yeah, it can be. I mean, you know, throughout history, you know, humor has been used as a way to get through tough situations and a survival mechanism. Now, that being said, you know, this is the first thing I've done since March 10th. I normally do shows. I usually do 2 to 4 shows a night, every night. I haven't done anything in, you know, 6 weeks or so. So the first 3-4 weeks after things got shut down, I was just in survival mode, you know. I know so many people who were sick. I was sick for a while. Fortunately, I was lucky; it wasn't that sick. I'll knock on wood. And then, so I couldn't do anything. I couldn't. I wasn't able to. You have to take care of your health, and it's tricky in the U.S. And many countries certainly, and there are countries worse off than us, where you have a new disease to worry about, and then you have a federal government that's actively working. Well, first of all, there's incompetence, but then they're actively working to harm people. They're Republican held states, well, they'll give some money, and the Democratic states where they won't give any money. And so it's a scary situation, and like I said, the government is either not helping the people at all or not helping nearly enough. So, that's why in the US you see a lot of hoarding, people go to the grocery store and they buy tons of stuff, because many of them know the government's not going to fucking look out for you. So it's, and I'm not defending people who buy the guns, but that's one of the reasons they buy the guns, because they're scared,
Yeah, indeed. I mean, there are some differences. I mean, in Europe, at least, we still have, in most countries, although underfunded public services, but at least we have healthcare. And
right. And didn't the UK just nationalize? Did they nationalize the NHS or?
Well, the NHS has been nationalized.
Right, but weren't they wanting to privatize it? And
exactly.
But they're going to keep it national, right? Or,
I certainly hope that they do. Okay. But with this government, you never know. You never know. I mean, it's probably okay. they definitely want to privatize it. That's definitely a sure.
See, here everything's already privatized, and now they're trying to get rid of the postal service here, and we have an election coming up, and there are people who think it's going to be safer to vote by mail, and you have the Republicans who want to try to make the post office go out of business and bankrupt them. The post office is asking for money, and the Republicans won't give them money. So it's, and then the Democrats aren't fighting nearly hard enough. So,
absolutely. Look, I want
to yes, the UK nationalized the railways. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. The railways. Yeah. No. I wanted to pass something by you, which is, again, it goes back to comedy, but it's really about laughter, the concept of laughter, which has been.
I know I'm being very serious here. Sorry about all that.
No. It's we are talking about serious issues after all, but the concept of laughter has been with us for a long time. Since I can remember, and even before that, we go back to Plato and Thomas Hobbes, who theorized, and this was like a 2,000-year time span, that humans laugh due to this, I'm being a bit simplistic here, but bear with me, that they laugh due to a perception of superiority vis-a-vis others. And then later on, we had Immanuel Kant and Schopenhauer, who basically suggested that it's due to a broken expectation, right? That makes us laugh. So for example, you're walking on the street and you're walking with a friend of yours, and your friend unexpectedly falls over, and the immediate reaction that we have usually is to laugh, unless they're really hurt. And later on, Freud advanced another kind of theory, and indeed laughter is about superiority, as Plato and Thomas Hobbes were arguing, but a paternal superiority. So not a superiority between people, but a superiority within yourself, between your superego and your ego. And I think one of the, and I'm not sure where you stand on this, but one of the, not my theory, I can't say it's my theory, but one of the things that I have to say is that, as far as I'm aware, human beings is the only animal in the animal kingdom that is aware of its own finity, i.e. we are aware that we're going to die at some point, and yet we laugh. And recently, a Portuguese satirist, Ricardo Araújo Pereira, said something which really put this into context for me. He said, well, think about it. Imagine somebody is on death row, right? And they're condemned to die and by the electric chair. Let's just say that. And at some point, they take this person from the cell and they take the person on the way to the electric chair. And at some point, let's imagine that this person starts laughing uncontrollably, right? Everybody should think that to be a bit absurd and bizarre, except we are going into the same direction, i.e. we're all, and I don't mean to be too pessimistic here, but we're all going into the same direction, i.e. we have a limited time on this planet, so we should do whatever we can in the best way possible to be good, I suppose. but we're also heading towards that electric chair, and yet we're laughing every step of the way. So we are aware of the fact that we're not going to be around, and maybe that is the reason why we laugh. That's another theory, but I don't know. What do you think about that?
I need to write all of that down and rewatch this later. But no, that's all interesting stuff, and I don't know all the answers to that. And laughter and humor is also different for everyone. But I'm sure some of that is correct. And yeah, and don't apologize for being pessimistic. I'm all for pessimism. And sometimes people get mad at me. They're like, you're being a pessimist. That's not good. I'm like, well, right now you're claiming to be an optimist, but you're being pessimistic. So I think there can be a lot of power in pessimism, but you still fight. So yeah, no, that's interesting. Yeah. So what you're saying about the humor is, sometimes the shocking thing is humorous, but sometimes it's not. I mean, there's are things that are shocking that happen, but that doesn't mean they're funny. So I think it can be, more layered than that. But the death is that's always an interesting subject. Death and the fear of death, or the acceptance of death. And I certainly do lots of jokes regarding death, and from all. I mean, in my stand-up movie, I talk about the death penalty, and in my new stand-up film I'm going to put out, I have bits about assisted suicide, and I talk about how I am against assisted suicide, because I think by definition and tradition, suicide is not a team effort. It's an expression of individuality. You take that away from someone, what else do they have to live for? So when I'm president, I'm going to make suicide illegal, punishable by the death penalty. That's not your decision. It's Uncle Sam's.
Well, let's go into a more optimistic direction, if you will. I wanted to ask you, I mean, for us at DiEM25, we're very interested in, like I said, in humor, in comedy. But what I've noticed over the last, since I've been involved in politics, since I've been alive even, that I haven't really seen how any really good examples, continuous examples of political movements and social movements using comedy and humor in a subversive way, not just to, make jokes and laugh about the establishment, but also to,
yeah, I mean, comedies, it's not everyone's a comedic genius. I don't know what to tell you on that one, but comedy can be a very powerful thing. But, I would never be so arrogant to say that my comedy is going to change anything. I think once if you start getting that cocky or like that self-importance, you're defeating any fucking comedy. It's like, I mean, comedy is, I'm like, this is a serious discussion. This isn't a comedic discussion, but that's the best. That's what I'm best at. That's doing stand-up comedy, doing satire. That's what I'm best at. But at the same time, I think in order to be good, you have to be so critical of yourself, and you have to realize you're a tiny part of this world and this universe, and ultimately maybe powerless. But that being said, humor can be powerful and have a lot of effect too. But I'm just saying, from a comedian's perspective, at least for mine, it's not to view yourself that way, because then if you start thinking you're invincible and the greatest, then you probably suck. But and these are, I satirize in my act. And in my act, I used to really make fun of narcissism and arrogance on a personal level, on people becoming so, that's what the whole world champion persona I would do jokes about, these incredible, bragging things about all these ridiculous athletic achievements I would do. And then it sort of morphed into, it wasn't bragging, it was someone who actually is so good at this. And then it started morphing into, I don't know, 10 or more years ago, instead of satirizing individual narcissism, satirizing national narcissism of America, and doing that. So and it keeps progressing, but that's, kind of what I've been doing. I have no idea if I answered your question or not. Sorry about it.
Well, it's you did it and you did it, and it's fine. You know, we were just having a conversation. But I mean, I don't know if you have maybe, yeah. But the question really was about how can social movements utilize comedy in communications?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I'm always trying to do stuff, you know, with my humor that pushes, you know, that one is rebellious and that one is, it's not, you know, I think it's important to, like, you know, even, you know, the term political comedy, I usually don't use that to describe my act because people have different definitions of what political comedy is. A lot of people, I think of political comedy as, okay, you're going to talk about what this politician said that day, and then how that's going to affect that politician in the polls, and was that the politically smart thing to do to advance that politician's career and get those votes. I'm not interested in that shit. You know, I'm interested in human rights and oppression and government corruption and just, you know, fighting for people and fighting for every living thing on the planet So anyways, I forgot what we were talking about. What were we talking about?
Don't talk about social movements and so on, but everything you've just said now is basically everything that in DiEM.
But humor can be, you know, it can be, there's a way to do humor where it can be very biting, it can be very speaking truth to power, but it can also be embracing of people. Because, you know, while you might, you know, there are certain political parties and stuff that are very dangerous, you know, ultimately, if you want to build a movement of people, you need more numbers. The more people you have, the better. So it's not always good to shit on people who are fans of shitty politicians and evil politicians, you know, because, you know, they're often misled, you know, and they don't know they're being misled. And then there's the whole other argument you can make. Well, human beings, if you look at history, human beings, we are the most destructive force this planet has ever seen. So are humans evil? You know, do humans, you know, that's one thing they talk about, you know, like, oh, nobody's raised to hate, you know, nobody's born hating. And I'm like, well, I don't know. I think maybe people are born hateful. You know, they're not taught that. Maybe that is the natural instinct for many people, and having compassion and empathy is not a majority of the people. So, you know, I don't know, but this, I mean, I do a joke about that in my previous stand-up film, you know, where they say, you know, I say that they say love wins. And I say, well, you know, hate has a pretty strong track record. If you look at history, hate's been pretty fucking dominant, you know. So it's, you're fighting against so many things, you know. It's hard to say, you know, if you look at the history of the world, how much of the history has there actually been peace, love, and equality? You know, have we ever had it?
I think the question here really is about power.
That's not the default. That's not the default. The default is a few terrible people killing people and making life miserable for people. That's how the world's mostly worked. At least it seems that way to me, you know.
No, it has been like that. But I mean, what I would say is that this is really, a lot of it is about power relations, and it's about those who are oppressed versus the oppressors. And so there's also, it's a lot of it is about power. It's about class as well, which often people don't talk about anymore, which I think they should.
Race, class, gender, it's everything's intertwined, I think.
Absolutely. But Judah, we have 20 minutes left, more or less, and now I still have some questions for you from the audience. But first of all, I just wanted to, before we go to that, just one last question from me, which is about, I heard you talk a little bit about the impact of social media as well, and, you know, on comedy. So how has that impacted your comedy? Because I think a lot of the comedians nowadays, sometimes they might say things on social media, which might then be misinterpreted, and then they're classified as something, you know, evil or something.
No, these are great questions, and social media, I think, has great things about it, mixed things, and terrible things about it. And one of the tricky issues with activism on social media is these social media platforms are designed to be narcissistic. So, I mean, that's how most people use them. You know, people want to get the most followers, the most friends, and then they want that check mark, and then they and then they get all these followers, and then they get some power, and then maybe they can monetize it and make money off of it. So if you're fighting for human rights, yet self-promoting at the same time, that's a fucking conflict of interest. And I think there is a lot of that. And I think some of it is intentional. I think some of it is unintentional, because I think the platforms are designed to be that way. So it can be difficult. And then, there's, on the other downside, is getting news and information that's accurate and not, propaganda and fake stuff. On the other hand, it opens up the world. It's, I'm in the U.S., you're in Belgium now, people watching from different places. It's fantastic. And then, you can be exposed to so many people with great insights and great movements and learn so much. But there's also the opportunity to be miseducated so much. And there's a lot of people that fall into that category. So it's like the world and like life. It's tricky. It's a mixture of all these things. But I do think the narcissism that permeates the platforms, it is a dangerous thing.
Yeah, indeed, I completely agree, and I think that, I don't know if you probably heard about this, but the whole idea of safe spaces was precise before, not now, but before. The idea of a safe space was so that opposing sides would meet together in a safe space in order to discuss the issues that they're facing and to try and come to some kind of synthesis, some kind of solution. And nowadays, especially with social media, I have this feeling that the idea of a safe space has become completely different. It's just space where you talk to people you already agree with and not engage necessarily in open discussion.
Yeah. Well, so, and I don't know worldwide how this is and how it varies in different countries. I can speak about what I see in the US is, well, first of all, compared to Europe, the US is much more capitalist. It's the fact that throughout Europe, most of your stores are closed on Sundays is still fucking bizarre. It's and the fact that in the UK there's pubs where you can just sit in a chair or a couch for hours and nobody's going to tell you to buy something or get the fuck out. That's still bizarre to someone coming from the US. So, in the US it's sell, buy, buy. But when it talks to what you were just talking about, dishonesty is another thing that I think permeates culture. If you look at people, just people who are dating, let's say people are, not even dating. People don't even use that word, I don't think anymore, but, two people going out, if one person, hooks up with a lot of other people, they'll say, oh, wow, that guy, he's got game. So it's a game. Look at the words. They're saying he's got game. Or that person, they're a player. So it's a game to people. And then, there's so much in social media about winning or owning people. It's like, people be like, oh, this person tweeted something and then this person shit all over them. And wow, that was great. But it's like, well, what was the fucking point of either one of those though? So there's a lot of that, and that goes into narcissism. It goes into dishonesty. So when people talk about fake news, fake news is not a new concept. It's always been around. It's used in, a little different ways maybe now than it has been in the past, but it's always been around. And then, look at like in the US, let's say two people meet, right? Whether it's online or in person. And if one of them likes the other one, they won't tell that person that. They'll go to their friend, hey, I like this person. When do you think I should message them back? Well, it's like, well, you should message them. Shouldn't you just message them back? Why do you have to fucking wait and play a game? Why are you afraid if you message them back the next day, they're going to think that's too early? It's like there's no honesty. It's like honesty and just people being genuine. It's almost like it doesn't fucking exist in society. So it's just, it's, so when you see someone like Trump being president, it really makes a lot of sense. There's someone who's very dishonest and very narcissistic and very corrupt. So yeah, that's what most of society is. So someone like that, unfortunately, probably represents a lot of the country pretty well.
And our job is to change that.
Right, exactly. Right.
I wanted to ask you. There's some questions from the audience, so let's go to them because time is running out. One of them is, which I personally also wanted to ask, is what does the Morse code on Judas's hat say?
Oh, it's in Morse code, and it says world champion. So,
Well,
these are dark times. It's dark times, so it's in Morse code. Yeah.
We needed that, so thanks a lot. That was a quick one. The second question that I have here is related to a little bit of around censorship and so on, which is there any topic that should be off limits for jokes, or which at least you personally wouldn't touch?
I don't know about that. It really depends the context and the point of the jokes, and people need to be careful about censorship. It's any subject, depending on how you're doing it, can be great and be appropriate. It's all about what you're, like if someone says, don't do a joke about rape, any joke about rape, don't even say the word rape. But what if you're doing a joke that is anti-rape? Some people don't even want you to do that. It's like, well, you should be able to do jokes about the evils of rape and rape culture, instead of just never doing it. Otherwise, how do you progress as a society if there's something you can't even talk about at all? So, no, I mean, general, I don't like things that are jokes where their point is to be racist, to be sexist, to be classist, to be, I don't like that stuff. I don't do that stuff. But subject matter, I think you should be able to, talk about anything. It's how you do it and what's the ultimate point of what you're doing. So.
Indeed. No, thanks for that, Judah. Well, we've got another question here, which this one says, truth is now stranger than fiction. How does this affect comedy and the entertainment industry in general? Are we now as a populace needing different types of genres and content than what we have consumed for the last decades?
I see the point. I don't necessarily agree with that, that truth is stranger than fiction. I don't necessarily agree with that premise. I think, maybe you're seeing it now that it is, but I think that stuff's always been around. It's just, it might be, you might be seeing more of it now than you did 10 years ago, but it's still around, I mean.
There's another question here, which is about the US presidential race, and maybe you can say a few words about that. And
there's another thing. There's another word you just said. It's a race. Again, it's a competition.
It's a run. Yeah.
Right, but that's right. But I'm saying, like, there's so many words we have that are in our language that tilt things in a way that's really inappropriate and technically dangerous that you don't even realize. Why is it fucking called a race? And again, that's how the US covers things. Everything's covered like a sporting event, instead of talking about real issues. And then you wonder why you don't have politicians who are in power who are talking about real issues, and then, so anyways, yeah. What was the question?
You're right. The question was, I agree with you as well. It shouldn't be a race. Absolutely not. Although I use that word, so it's my bad.
No, but say the question again. I'll answer it.
The question is, why didn't the Democrats pick Sanders if he could beat Trump? So maybe you can talk a little bit about that. I mean, do you think Sanders?
I'll tell you why. Because Sanders' platform was for human rights, and that's not the Democrats' platform. Now, the Democrats' platform isn't as bad as the Republicans, but it's still bad. It's they don't want people having power. So that's it. It's simple. He's he doesn't represent what the Democrats represent. The Democrats represent a friendlier not as racist, not as sexist form of corporate capitalism as the Republicans, So why would they pick someone like Sanders, And, I mean, I wish they did, but they wouldn't do that. No, see, the other thing is that in the US, there's basically two teams. We're going back to sports again, right? There's basically two teams. You have the Republicans and you have the Democrats. So if the Democrats lose every election, they're still in power because there's still only two parties, right? But if Bernie wins, he's going to pick people that haven't been in power before. So all these players on the Democratic team are now going to be put on the bench. They're going to be put off the team. So they don't want someone like Sanders because then they don't have jobs and they don't have power. So, because if Sanders comes in, that's really a third team coming in, and they don't want a third team. So the Democrats will fight harder against progressives than they will against Republicans. I remember when Trump was running and Steve Bannon was his head of the campaign, or maybe this is even when they were first in the office. Steve Bannon said, "We view the press as the opposition party." Now that's scary and dangerous in a lot of ways, but because they're attacking the press, but the other thing is by him saying that, they weren't even viewing the Democrats as the opposition party, and that tells you a lot.
Indeed, it just goes to show that they're two sides of the same coin. Often in DiEM, we talk about it. We talk about not only the liberal establishment, but also the fact that we have the rising. I mean, it's always been there, but it's continuously going up and up. The rise of what we call the nationalist international. We have basically capital, which is global. We have Steve Bannon actually in Brussels setting up what's called the movement.
Right. I read about that.
As you know, I mean, the KKK used to be called the organization. That's how it used to be referred to. And now we've got something called the movement in the center of Brussels, in where I live, not so close, not so far from here, trying to create the conditions to be able to fund all the nationalist parties, which is already strange, nationalist parties being transnationalized in a way. But the only ones that seem yet to go in that direction, although we are trying to do it now with the Progressive International, I think Shrechko and I told you a little bit about this, is because we need to have a counterforce, not only to the Nationalist International, but also to the fact that you have the liberal establishment across the globe colluding to advance their own interests, and anybody that has a threat, Bernie Sanders or anybody else, is, shut down, undermined, and maybe even killed. You have Julian Assange, for example, now in prison in Belmarsh for speaking the truth and showing the crimes against humanity that were committed.
Very scary. And that goes to another reason why Sanders didn't win and couldn't win in our system, is that he was running against the Republicans and the Democrats. The other Democratic candidates are just running against the Republican Party. They're not running against the Democratic Party. Bernie ran against the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, even though he ran as a Democrat. So how do you fucking win that, So, yeah, because there's a lot of people who've been shitting on Sanders in the campaign about, they didn't do this right, they didn't do that right. I don't think they realize how fucking hard it is. It's fighting for human rights, winning human rights. That's probably the hardest thing there is. So it's not like if they would have done one little thing different, one little strategy different, we would have got it. They're trying to do the hardest thing there is. So, if someone's trying to get elected and they're for human rights, unfortunately, the majority of governments in the country, that's not what they're about. So.
Indeed. Well, let's work to change that. That's why we exist as DiEM, and I hope that you
vote for me for president.
We'll have Judah as our number one champ of the world. Judah, before we finish, we have 5 minutes or so left. I wanted to ask you a question, which is really, what would you be your message to people who might be watching this 5 years from now? What would you say to them? What would you want to tell them? Or also a positive remark, any kind of positive remark about the future you have in mind.
Just always be fighting for other people, for yourself, and everybody's got to fight for everybody. You know, I did a couple years ago, I was doing an art project on Instagram called Activist Barbie. It was the Barbie doll, which is, if you don't know, is like an iconic toy figure, blonde. And I would go to all these protests. You know, I'd go to Black Lives Matter protests. I mean, I was going anyways, but I would take the doll with me. And because I was like, you know, you'd see some protests and you'd be like, you know, if it was for, you know, whatever issue it was for, the most of the people at that protest were those people who were being directly oppressed. And I'm like, well, everybody should be fighting for everybody. You know, you can't, if, you know, if there's a gay rights protest and there's only gay people there, what's the point of that? You got to have everybody there. So that's what the Activist Barbie was everybody should be fighting for everybody, you know, and sometimes things get, you know, sometimes even activism gets segregated, you know, and we can't have that. Everybody has to fight for everybody, and you got to fight with love. You can't fight with hate. I think you got to fight with love. You got to find a way to fight with love, you know.
Yeah, I mean, love has to win in the end. We can't let hate take over. That's a terrible sentiment. I wanted to just, before we go, I wanted to pass something else by you, which is that, you know, as you know, and you've said this before, governments have for centuries repressed comedy. They've jailed satirists. They've even condemned them to death. Yeah. But for all their efforts, it seems that comedy, even if it has to go into kind of clandestine such conditions, it's still alive today. But wouldn't you agree that this repression by authoritarian regimes, and also even in, let's say, more liberal democracies that, you know, in the West, that this kind of repression against satire and against comedy simply shows the impotence of the powers that be? I mean, essentially their lack of power, that they feel so threatened by a joke that they feel like they have to, you know.
Well, I mean, that's great. I don't know enough historical and world context to answer that question. I don't know enough. So I don't know. I like your positivity in that, but I just don't know. But I'll tell you, in the US and in Hollywood, you know, it's often the liberal people that are doing a lot of the oppressing. You know, when as a comic, if you have to go on a TV talk show, they want to know every fucking word you're saying, and they want to make sure, one, that it's not offensive to anything or anyone, but mostly it's their sponsors. So the more corporate, you know, they really don't want to hear any kind of corporate criticism. You know, they either want to hear Republican talking points or Democrat talking points. They don't want to hear you criticizing the entire system. They don't want that because they're part of that system and they prop up that system.
That's something else.
So that and the censorship it can come from the fascists. It can also come from, you know, the non-fascists.
And on that point, I think sometimes we have this idea that, I mean, we live in, let's say, Western societies. I'm in Brussels, you are in America, and you have this concept of freedom, right? And on the one hand, you know, people who live in more, let's say, illiberal regimes, who at least they understand what the rules are, the rules of the game, right? You know what you can and cannot do. A lot of the time in the West, we live under this impression of real freedom, that we have the ability and the freedom to do whatever we want. But the thing is, the reality is, in my opinion, that we live in a very constrained form of reality, if you like, and that freedom isn't really
fake freedom,
right? Yeah. Where you will live within these coordinates, the system is coordinates.
That's one of government's big tricks is, hey, we have this free open society, but then you wind up self-censoring yourself. So if you wind up self-censoring and self-controlling yourself, the government's done its job without even having to technically do it. You know, they don't have to put the military on the streets to control you if you're controlling yourself but it's really under their direction, and you may or may not realize it. Yeah.
Indeed, and we will do our best to transform it. And I hope, Judah, thanks very much for joining us. It's been really a pleasure to talk to you.
Gotta keep fighting. We're gonna do it.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, talking about keep fighting, I must say to everybody who's watching us, thank you very much for watching our show. If you please do share it on social media, etc. Do also, if you can, check out the description of the event on YouTube, because DiEM25 is 100% funded by individual small membership donations. So if you can help us to keep this going and to do in our mission to transform Europe and the world, please, do every little helps, as they say. So the link is in the description of the video. Judah, again, a major pleasure to have you on. I hope to see you again soon. And whenever you come to Brussels, I'd be happy to show you around.
That would be great. I did a show in Antwerp last year. So yeah, whenever, we'll see. I don't know when we'll ever be allowed to leave the country here, but we'll see. And I don't know when live comedy shows will happen again, but I will see you in the future. And keep doing the great work you guys are doing. It's very important stuff. So thanks for having me on it. And there you go. Yeah. Keep fighting, everybody. Much love. Stay safe.
Absolutely. Thank you, Judith, for the work that you've done behind the scenes with the live stream as well. Ciao, guys. Thanks for watching, and see you soon. Bye-bye.